Welcome to AEC Insights, How to Navigate Through COVID-19. This AEC webinar brought to you by the AIAKC and the Builders Association is focused on how architects, engineers, and constructors are navigating through COVID-19 and what the future holds for this industry. My name is Richard Bruce, and I am the Workforce and Professional Development Director for the Builders Association, and I will be your moderator today. I'm honored to be joined today by 6 highly respected industry experts. Bill Bourne, AIA Associate Principal, POPULOUS. Amy Eckhoff, AIA Partner, GastingerWalker. Ryan Manis, AIA Vice President and General Counsel, McCownGordon Construction. Jim Sherman, Program Manager, Johnson County, Kansas Contractor Licensing. Phil Shoemaker, Safety, Health, and Environmental Services Director, the Builders Association. And Phil Thomas, President, A.L. Huber. Hey, before we get into today's discussion, we'd like to understand our audience relative to today's topic. So please answer the following questions using the poll feature within Zoom. So the first question is, how many of you anticipate being on the job site in the next 2 weeks, 4 weeks, or both? The next question is, how many of you are concerned about your safety during an upcoming job site visit? And the third question is, how many of you have either received COVID-19 job site training or reviewed employer, OSHA, CDC, or other job site guidelines? I'll give you just a few minutes to answer those questions. And can you share those results with everyone?
Yeah, sorry, Richard. It should be coming through. But so for the first question, how many of you anticipate being on the job site in the next 2 weeks or 4 weeks or both? Looks like only 10% said 2 weeks, 40% say 4 weeks, and 50% say both. The second question was, how many of you are concerned about your safety during your upcoming job site visit? And it is 65% for I am, and it's changing as we talk. Now it's 43%, not really. And then the last question of how many of you have received COVID-19 job site training or reviewed employer OSHA, CDC, or other job site guidelines, 65% have and 33% have not. And I know those numbers don't exactly add up to 100, but it is changing as I talk right now. And we have had 25 people have chimed in on that question.
So the organizer of this event, Ryan Warman with Pearson Construction and President of AIA Kansas City, Don Taylor, Executive Director of AIA Kansas City, and Don Greenwell, President of the Builders Association, have created 7 questions that are going to provide a great foundation for this discussion. I will direct each question to a specific panelist today, and at the end, we'll have this, we'll open it up to discussion from our guests. So the committee thought we should start with some best practices. So, just to be clear, a best practice is not cutting your own hair with a foreguard before the barbershops reopened like I did, right? So a best practice instead is like doing like our first panelist, Phil Shoemaker, who waited until the barbershops were all open before going and getting his haircut. So Phil Shoemaker, in regard to the first question, could you provide some best practices in COVID-19 health and safety protocol on job sites?
Yes, Richard, I want to thank you for having me as a panelist. Of course, one of the biggest issues is how do we socially distance ourselves on job sites? And if we can't socially distance ourselves, how do we go about doing that? Some good best practices that we're starting to see and a lot of our members have implemented is actually job site signage is probably the first step into the project to identify and put people on notice of what procedures or protocol they should be taking on that specific project. Also, doing some type of pre-work acknowledgement or job site pre-screening program is definitely something we've seen a lot of the member companies have implemented. They have trade partners and their employees actually complete daily surveys of their medical conditions, if they have any symptoms and things like that. Non-touch temperature screenings. Some job sites have implemented that where they use third-party providers to do that. We're seeing that. And have written procedures if they have somebody that they recognize that as doesn't answer the right questions or has an elevated temperature, how they deal with that. Additional to that is actually providing the training for the employees and trade partners or visitors that enter the project sites. Personal protective equipment, we've seen a lot of changes over the last 60 plus days of what personal protective equipment's utilized on the job site. Now we see a lot of companies that are following CDC guidelines and utilizing the face mask. I highly encourage the face mask on the job site. You may not be able to social distance enough for the face mask. You may have to move up to another level, such as, face shields or possibly even an N95 respirator for cases that you're not able to maintain that distancing. Again, if you're using an N95 respirator, you'd have to have a written respiratory protection program, have your people medically evaluated and fit tested prior to wearing an N95 respirator. And finally, the last piece of personal protective equipment would be the right type appropriate gloves. Hand washing stations, we're seeing those now on job sites, various homemade ones, non-touch hand washing stations that allow you to wash your hands up to 20 seconds, another best practice. Cleaning and disinfecting of the job sites, there's lots of different protocols on that, and making sure that people, if you have shared equipment that's properly being sanitized, the handrails are being sanitized on job sites. You might be increasing the toilets, getting service, something as simplistic as that. If you have 100 people on your job site and you're getting your toilet service once a week, that's not adequate today. Then what do you do if somebody actually exhibits COVID-19 symptoms or has been involved with that? What written procedures or protocols does your company have in place for dealing with that? Then finally, the OSHA does not have a standard on COVID-19. However, they do have specific guidelines now for record keeping that employers are required to follow, and those have just recently changed this week. So that's a lot in a mouthful there.
Yeah, thank you, Phil. So, throughout this whole process, what I find fascinating is, so many of these best practices are happening on the fly, before regulations. Even the CDC was really quick, they kind of saw this coming a while ago, and so they were really quick to kind of get out there, but it's just so fascinating and exciting to see contractors and architects and building officials alike just kind of making these, I hate to say making it up as you go, but really it is, it's coming up with what makes sense to your company on that job site. So, I think Ryan Manis has some great best practices he wanted to share. Ryan, as general counsel for McCownGordon Construction, do you have some insight into what's happening on the job site? What are some best practices, and how are we addressing compliance?
Sure, thanks, Richard, and I appreciate being part of this panel. A lot of, I don't want to be redundant with Phil Shoemaker. He touched on a lot of, if not most of the best practices that contractors are or should be following. I'll tell you, I guess, some of the things that maybe he didn't touch on or expand on a couple of them, as well as talk about sort of what our process was when the COVID-19 situation first occurred. I think everyone can agree that this sort of caught everybody flat-footed, and no one really realized what the impact would be locally or nationally. And it was sort of a day-by-day evolving situation. The first thing we did was we put together a COVID-19 response plan and task force. That task force met every day. It was made up of numerous people, from our CEO to our Vice President of Construction Operations, myself, even our CFO, because of financial impacts that were occurring on the projects, and numerous of our business unit leaders who are tasked and in charge of our projects. We met at first every day, and then as the situation became a little more known or stable, we then sort of scaled those back to every other day and then a couple times a week, and we now meet as needed. But our primary goal was to keep associates, clients, partners safe and to reduce the spread of COVID-19. That's sort of the overarching theme of everything that we did and every decision we made. And number two, to ensure compliance with contractual, governmental, and regulatory obligations. You all know that there was no sort of central voice as to what to do, and so you were getting information from the WHO, the CDC. Phil mentioned OSHA, record-keeping requirements. And then if any of you were listening to NPR this morning, there was actually a national piece on Kansas City, specifically talking about the difficulty Kansas City has had with dealing with this issue because of our division of state lines and the number of counties and then cities that we have. So we were getting guidance, again, from the federal government, CDC, and then as well as all the multiple jurisdictions around us, the counties, the cities, and trying to make sense of all of that. What we ended up doing, well, first of all, we evaluate all of them. Luckily, construction was deemed an essential service in all of those, so that allowed us to continue to work. And then we just kind of went with the most stringent requirements since that was sort of the safest thing to do. We put a dedicated COVID-19 manager and coordinator in place, a new superintendent that we had hired, and he was in charge for ensuring that compliance was standard across the board. And as you can imagine, while every subcontractor may have their own plan, we as construction manager are responsible for implementing our own plan and ensuring that our projects are safe. So like Phil said, we had the Johnny's hand washing stations, hand sanitizing stations, disposable gloves, disinfectants. The biggest problem, however, was not the list of things that we needed to have for best practices, but was trying to get those materials. Everybody's trying to get those materials. They're not there. So it was really a scramble to try to get those masks and gloves and the temporary toilets, hand washing stations, all of that. We tried to do as good job as we could with project signing. Projects, any given construction project has a lot of construction signing associated with it, but then we added to that signage at all site entrances about one direction in, one direction out. But, that caused quite a few problems. Just the transportation in some of our larger sites where we have buildings with multiple floors, limiting the number of people on hoists and elevators. That really slows the projects down. As such, we did staggered start times, stairwells, one way up, one way down. Shift workers, we tried to do 4-10s to reduce the potential exposure by having a 3-day weekend and second shifts to reduce the number of workers on site. By and large, knock on wood, we've had our construction operations director the other day talked about how many man hours we have worked since the beginning of the COVID-19 situation, and we have not had any instances to date. And I'd like to think that's because of, it's probably a lot of good luck, but also because of the practices that we've implemented here at McCownGordon.
So those practices were just kind of rolled out company-wide, and did it really, did the jurisdiction impact how you rolled that out, or was it pretty much, on every job site you kind of stuck to these standard?
Yeah, like I said, because of the multiple jurisdictions, and we work outside of Kansas City, so we're not just talking about the 7 counties and X number of cities within the Kansas City metropolitan area, but then, all of the counties and cities in, say, Western Kansas, South Dakota, Oklahoma, Arkansas that we work in, that, it was really important, to just ensure that we were deemed an essential service, right? That's sort of the threshold question. Are you deemed an essential service so that you can continue your operations? If that's yes, then number 2 is, well, let's find the most stringent requirements that we can in all the various jurisdictions and or CDC, WHO. We really went with CDC requirements. CDC are the most restrictive requirements, at least we found, and then try to implement the CDC requirements, and where there were gaps in those requirements, came up with our own best practices and implemented them across the board on all of our projects.
Great points. Great points. Thank you. That kind of brings us to Amy Eckhoff. And Amy, you're an architect, and you might be one of these architects that are feel compelled to go to the job site. And so why are you going to the job site? If you could just kind of go over why architects are visiting the job site these days, and some pressures and issues there.
Sure. Thanks for having me. So I'll speak in kind of general terms, because obviously one of the things that we've had to do is go through and consider the specific contract language for every one of our projects, every one of our clients, because it does vary based on the project. But speaking in general terms, and the general contractual obligations that we would have, we would visit the job site typically to observe the progress and quality of the work. So we need to determine if the work's being performed in accordance with contract documents. We need to identify if there's deviations from those documents or any code requirements. And we need to confirm whether progress on site is aligning with approved construction schedules. And that also informs our approval of pay applications. So, obviously it's a team effort with the contractors, but we're always there to kind of just be that little extra set of eyes and do those checks and balances. So we're not typically obligated to make exhaustive or continuous on-site inspections. And obviously we don't have control over construction means, methods, or your job site safety. But it is within our standard of care to perform our contractual duties to the best of our ability. And, when we talk about standard of care for architects, that's, it generally comes down to what typically can people do and what, professional skill and care would ordinarily be provided. So obviously that's been different on multiple jobs. Some of our clients have shut down work, so that's a whole different story. And obviously we are obligated to follow local laws and orders. Since so many jurisdictions have deemed construction an essential service, our services are essential right along with it. So it's important for us to still be on the job site. Obviously, where we get into travel, and we've been limited to travel outside of our metro area, that becomes a challenge. Really it's a cooperative effort. We're used to having to adjust our PPE to a client or contractor's needs, whether that's having to wear steel-toed boots or a safety vest or putting on a mask or gloves. We can tailor that appropriate to the job site. I think Bill might talk a little bit later about some of the technologies that we've started to use to do more long distance, which I think could change the way we do job site visits in the future. But we're finding technology isn't quite caught up with being able to do that. I think the biggest thing from our perspective is cooperation. We all want to keep everybody safe, but we still need to be able to put our eyes on the work as it proceeds.
I always envisioned there being drones that would, not just take that work away from architects at all, but, for superintendents, there was a superintendent or job site cam that went on your hard hat. So I always envisioned that, lower level worker could be, instructed to go visit a certain part of the job, and, and his boss or her boss could be over their shoulder looking and checking on that particular bit. So
yeah, and those active live streams have been very helpful for our projects that are out of town.
All right, well, great. Thank you, Amy, for those comments. So similar to architect and engineer inspections, we have local building officials needing to inspect projects. So Jim Sherman, as the program manager for the Johnson County Contractor Licensing, how are code inspections getting done?
Well, thanks, Richard, for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be able to address some of these comments to everyone. Like the construction industry and the design professionals, it did catch us off balance a little bit. There was some precursor language about possibly shutting down, but in the past, government facilities really haven't been considered that. We've always stayed open during snowstorms, flooding, different types of events. But in this case, due to the state and the county, Johnson County order, we were essentially closed for business. What we were finding was most construction activity, though, because it was listed as an essential activity, were ongoing and needing our services as building officials and inspectors. Fortunately, over the time from years past, most departments have gone to some sort of digital plan review or digital inspection recording. So most building inspectors operate off of a Surface Pro or an iPad in the field. So essentially, most building inspectors will operate out of their truck and from home. They weren't needing to have a central base such as an office that was no longer open. So the field inspection part of it has gone fairly well. I'm not aware in polling a lot of the other different building officials that they were essentially shut down. Some of the normal processes were much slower, but the field inspectors were able to still adjust to the needs and make their field inspections. Now, what we did find with that, though, is, as with everybody who does more interior work, occupied dwellings were kind of, for the most part, off limits for inspections unless the owner really wanted to have the inspector in, which that wasn't, we weren't finding that too often. It had to been some kind of really essential need to get in there to maybe a sewer line repair that they have to cover up and they have to go inside the house, or but even simple things like water heater and furnace, they were just going to be deferred inspections. A few departments were operating kind of in a virtual mode where the homeowner had Wi-Fi capabilities and they were able to stream the inspection of an activity back to the building inspection office, and the inspector would sit there and they would, or on their iPad or Surface Pro or Microsoft device, they would look at it and deem whether it was compliant or not. Nothing too technical and nothing too, they were testable, of course, but general, maybe an insulation inspection or a drywall inspection, those types of interior inspections were found. But we did see that many of the inspection departments, for the most part, weren't inspecting occupied dwellings. The new construction really kept going pretty seamlessly. There wasn't the delays expected. We have our own website where we chat and talk, and there wasn't much of a delay in that aspect. Most departments had some kind of form to be able to contact the office of the building official. Now, plan review was a little different aspect because not all departments have online or e-government type capabilities to submit plans. And so there was the need to reach out or communicate with each department individually on how are you accepting plans, how are you getting those comments out, and maybe providing revised plans. A couple of departments I know in Johnson County did have online government, so their process was already set up to do e-plan review and e-submittals. What we found, those that didn't had to set up some kind of exchange where, you know, the FedEx or UPS delivery, they were able to meet them or have a drop-off location at the government facility where then the plans are transported to the plans examiner. What I found was most plans examiners were working from home, and they had some routines where they would go to the office, or plans were actually shuttled to them by field inspectors. But for the most part, plan review did slow down during the stay-at-home orders. Now that they're lifted, several plans examiners are going back to the office, but there was some delay in plan review. But that was, for the most part, from what I understand, was made known to applicants that there will be a little bit further delay. Some departments had some issues with just the fact their facilities, their setup was so based off of their facilities, it took them a couple of weeks to get set up to where they could accommodate the plan review. And then there were a couple departments that were able to do some kind of electronic communication with contractors, homeowners, even we forget sometimes the supply houses have questions, or they have needs to confirm installations of devices or products. So there was that time period also where we connected drop boxes or set up general email accounts. And briefly on the contractor licensing side, what hurt some of the contractors is we were able to still keep our business going and help provide our services, but the one aspect that wasn't out there was testing. I tried to poll the 4-state area, and there wasn't a test center, whether it was Prometric, ICC's Pearson View, or even some of the other smaller like IAPMO. No one was open, but so that was the one thing that we couldn't help anybody out because the national companies just had not set up online testing yet. I do think there would be a residual effect with this. I've already heard that they're planning on starting to implement programs where we can test contractors online now, much as we do building inspectors and building officials. So there's kind of some benefit out of this. It showed the need of not always having a visited place in person to take an exam, that all the securities are there to offer home exams. So we're encouraged about that aspect. But for the most part, because the government deemed it an essential activity, the building inspection departments remain still active with just some delays.
So you're not seeing any furloughs. I know I heard today there were some furloughs around town of planning departments and that. So you're not seeing any disruption there?
No, the only one I knew was the city of Olathe is actually going to furlough every employee for a 2-week period, but the departments are allowed to decide at what point between now and January 1st, at what point they furlough the employees. And I believe Olathe and anybody else that's going to go that route is waiting till more what we call the off season towards the holidays, like November, December, to implement that furlough. That's not set yet, but that's some of the thought process. The building inspection staffs, I don't know of anybody that furloughed. I hadn't heard through planning any furloughs. There was some shift work that went on. Maybe they adjusted their hours, but the actual furloughing of planners I hadn't been aware of yet.
All right, thank you. You know, Jim, I thought I was your biggest fan, but your background proves me wrong on that one. So thank you, Jim. Phil Thomas, you know, what are some solutions arising in the field?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you, and I really appreciate the builders and AIA having this. If there's ever a time that being a member of the builders and AGC and I'm sure the AIA has paid off, it's during the last couple months, and appreciate the leadership the builders and AGC has offered. You know, so success on the project always revolves around communication, and you know, the tech tools that have been there, but we're just utilizing them so much more effectively now, are around communication. And as Amy alluded to, some of these were always there, but they become so effective now that they'll probably be part of the new normal going forward. As far as navigating the project site, you know, whether it's the owner or the architect or even project managers from our subcontractors, everybody used to just drop in on the project site during the day. And, you know, now it's so valuable if you can let the superintendent know, set up a time that you're going to be there. One, so he can help manage your safety, but also manage the comfort level of the craftsman on the job site. Just like all of us have different comfort levels interacting with others. The craftsmen on the job site, we found there's a variety of comfort. So the superintendent helps to manage that and then manage the safety. And then also just with the more limited number of site visits that are occurring now, you know, we want to make sure that we get everything accomplished in one visit. I was on a virtual OAC meeting on Monday, and the architect mentioned, I was at the job this morning, but the superintendent didn't see him, and he said, well, could you come back tomorrow? Because we have these 3 things to look at. And so, you know, setting those up, setting time up would really help. We've all been on the virtual OAC meetings, and as Amy alluded to, I think these will probably be part of the future. Maybe not every meeting, because you can't replace being on the job site and seeing everything around you and filling the space. But maybe once a month, we're in person, and the rest of the time we're virtual. It saves so much travel time, and you know, depending on, like for me, I can now participate in all our OAC meetings because there's no travel time, and there's, you know, you just click in. So that's been really valuable. Similarly, a big time saver is the subcontractor weekly meetings online. And not only is this valuable for saving travel time, but it's also, you know, the meetings can be recorded, and it's a very good record of what was agreed to, what was discussed, and what was agreed to. So again, I see those being virtual a big part of the time going forward. So we've used video pre-installation conferences, and the effectiveness of those seems to be how much preparation was put in beforehand. You know, if people just show up and want to use the camera and show pictures, it's hard to wing that. So, you know, a pre-installation conference or a mock-up approval, if a lot of some preparation time could go into it, a good agenda, thinking about the details that need to be discussed, you know, a lot of times you could show up and just kind of wing it. But on the video pre-installation conferences or mock-up approval, it really helps to have a lot more preparation put into that. As Jim alluded to, we've had some follow-up visits with inspector where, hey, send me a video of this area or send me a picture when you complete this one wall. And so, you know, that's been helpful both from a schedule standpoint and just minimizing the number of visits on the job site. Video pre-bid walkthroughs. It actually seems like the RFI process through the last couple of months has sped up just because we can, you know, we're providing information, you know, photos, videos, and it seems like the RFI process has gotten smoother and faster through the last couple of months. We have webcams on several of our projects, and they've got a lot more use from everybody on the project, not only to see the progress on the project, but to watch the staffing and see the day-to-day operations and see how the money's being spent. And the last couple of things I just wanted to mention is for the last year or so, we've posted 360 degree photos on Procore of all the rooms at the rough end stage. And the viewing of those has went up tremendously. And not only from architects and owners, but our subcontractor project managers, because they can see the small details of what the crew's accomplishing, you know, every day or every week. And then the one thing that I'm participating in that I hope goes away, because I don't think it's as effective, is the virtual project interviews. We've participated in a few of these, and it's really hard to get a feel for the people, especially if you've never met the people before, to get a feel for the people that you're going to work with on your team for the next year and a half. And so anyway, that's one of the uses of the technology that I sure hope goes away. But anyway, thank you. I hope I addressed your question.
You did, even though I read the question wrong. You addressed it pretty well. So good job there. Yeah, you know the value of the handshake is just gone away, and so meeting someone and really talking to them, getting to know them, it's changed. So
hey, air high five.
Yeah, that's right. So Bill Bourne, you're very familiar with what is occurring beyond our region and on a large scale project. What have you seen done in other locations from a safety, technology, and collaboration communication standpoint?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. And Phil, Ryan, Amy, they all touched on some of the topics and things that we've been seeing, just general best practice of what's happening here in Kansas City is being echoed in other locations, but we do see maybe a little bit more variety in terms of restrictions in states and construction sites. Some, states we have seen where there has been construction has not been essential. So on some sites have been shut down, but some of our contractors have worked with state and government officials to reopen some of those sites where there might be safety to the built environment in terms of where structural components may be in place and can't be on hold for months at a time. And really it has increased the communication through all parties. In terms of the job site safety and travel evaluation, we're looking at safety of employees, but also the workers on the job site and the client. and really looking at the contract evaluation of do we need to be on site at this time, and are there other ways that we can make those obligations met with more creative means and communication. And where we do have to travel, really looking at the whole trip and not just the starting location and the destination, but where layovers may be, or what are the hotel policies, you know, for the architects or other members that may be traveling to the site. A lot of the sites do have, in larger cities, have temperature check-in at arrival and departure for the subcontractors. And we also have employees that have moved to job sites in certain cities that are living there. And so that has been a benefit that has limited the travel by plane or car to certain sites where we've had employees on site to communicate with. Procurement has been most of the projects have been proceeding on schedule. There has been, as I mentioned, some delays or some stoppages, but you know, a lot of the procurement, we have materials that come from all over the world, or even say in the US, where states have restricted out-of-state visitors. And again, contractors working with those officials saying, you know, these trucks delivering materials to the site, you know, have a pass to come and drop off to the site, and then we'll leave the state. I think the biggest takeaway, and some things that we may most likely will continue on future projects without some of the restrictions, has been the enormous collaboration between contractor, architect, client, and the engineering consultants on the jobs, where we have now done a lot of walkthroughs virtually, whether it's through Zoom or FaceTime or Chime, using the software of choice from the client or the contractor. But what it's allowed us to do is that instead of the architect being on site, you know, looking and observing the project on our own, we've now brought in and doing the walkthroughs with the mechanical engineer, the plumbing engineer, civil engineer, you know, together with the superintendent, as well as younger staff that may not have been scheduled for that trip. And so I think Phil mentioned he can, you know, sit in on the OAC, and we can now have the whole architectural team and consultants looking at everything together. So it's really helped on our end, the collaboration, the learning experience for younger staff, and giving the entire team a more holistic vision of the project and why there may be a conflict in a certain area, or why certain things are happening. So that's been a great element that, you know, we've been able to address and help, you know, foster that mentorship. It's also helped with not traveling. We've been able to focus on, I think Phil mentioned RFIs or other fires that might come up, that we can, you know, attend more closely to a lot of the other administrative, whether it is RFIs or submittals. Those things can keep going, you know, even if a job site is shut down. So we've been able to have a lot more coordination and planning with the contractors on items on the job site. But also, if you're not in a rental car or on a plane, you know, you have a lot more flexibility and communication with both the internal architectural team, but also consultants, contractors, and owners as well.
Great, thank you, thank you. So now we're kind of getting to the part of our program where we want to kind of go back through and ask a question of everyone, and I'll just pose this question, and then we'll maybe walk back through the panel in reverse order. So if you could think about some long-term effects of COVID-19, you know, so for example, megatrends that you see. So we'll start with you, Bill. Do you see any megatrends coming in the next few years?
You know, we're evaluating everything, you know, cautiously. There's been a lot of, I think, maybe knee-jerk reactions on certain things, and I think we've found it the best in terms of seeing how different regulations are being implemented. We work, across a global market, so everything is changing in different, different localities and areas. So I think maybe in the near term, some of the contractual language that I've seen on a couple projects that it's more in the construction phase, but that flexibility, there's some tolerance built into that construction schedule, from a 24-month schedule to say 30 months, to kind of have a 6-month buffer in there, that there may be some pending shutdowns in the future. And so I think architects would need to look at that too, in terms of how they're writing their contracts. So, so that they're, have fee or contingencies built in the event of say the construction time frame gets extended.
Yeah, exactly. When you were talking, I was thinking of in 2009, I was in China on a few trips, and that was the time of the swine flu, and so there was checks for temperature before you got on the airplane, before you went from province to province. So I never thought I'd see that again. So it's interesting to see that a lot of that same methodology is coming even to the job sites today. So, hey, Phil Thomas, how about you?
Well, two things that I think we've referred to that I think might be long-term, one positive and one potentially negative. Is the positive side is just the productivity, effectiveness, and collaboration. As Bill talked about collaboration, if we're working on a project now and we're estimating something about the estimate, instead of having one guy drive across town and go to a meeting, we can have 3 or 4 estimators in the room, and everybody can talk about their part and be much more clear, much more effective. So I think that collaboration part is going to be great. And then on the negative side, the construction industry has evolved over the last 25 years, where it became a lot less relationship based. It used to be you knew everybody really well that you worked with, and now you know everybody's email address really well, and you get to see people every now and then. And obviously this has the danger of taking that even further back, where you see everybody's avatar on the screen, but you don't really get to meet them and work together with building a relationship.
Jim Sherman, you were talking earlier about inspections as well as education. Do you want to talk about some megatrends you see in the building official world?
Sure, and thanks, Richard. It's part of some of my earlier comments. One of the things that, I've actually had a chance to talk to a couple of field inspectors that are now working out of their truck in their home. They're not office-based. We may be able to accommodate this in the future and have better service and delivery to contractors. Instead of working out of central offices, they may be more strategically placed around the county and their different jurisdictions, to where they can actually get to job sites quicker. They're not so much hung up on the formalities of checking in the office, paperwork, whatever their own system requires. And so it also, the other thing we've been talking about, we noticed this might bump up some jurisdictions to more electronic platforms for their department. Because at least my experience from probably the mid to late 2000s, most design professionals can work off of e-government pretty easy. It's our field that's a little lagging in that area. And so if we can kind of come up and meet them, this would maybe expedite some of the plan review or some of the document sharing platforms that are out there too. And so those two areas, I think, will be a plus. One, and then as Phil alluded to, one of the downsides are it is a small fraternity sorority type thing within the building officials and inspectors. We know Overland Park knows Shawnee, Lenexa knows Olathe. There won't be so much of that actual in-person FaceTime in the future. So we're going to need to develop a way to exchange ideas and what are you seeing in your jurisdiction? We may not do that face to face. So we have to figure out a way to still keep that important contact ability up, and so we can serve the contractors and designers out in the field.
Thank you, Jim. Amy?
Well, I think a couple of things. One, like Phil Thomas alluded to, being able to conduct some of the OAC meetings, some of the pre-construction meetings, some of these things virtually, we actually do better because we're able to share content on the fly digitally. We actually are able to show photos. We save on travel time. So being able to have a certain number of those conducted virtually, I think will become a trend. And the great thing about that is your record is digital as well. We can record those meetings. We can have much better records of our interactions. And that includes even those on-site visits if they start to be filmed. And then on the construction side, I've wondered too, is this going to change the nature of some of prefabrication? What kinds of things can be pre-assembled off-site in order to keep staff, limited on the job site and actually allow them to keep more distancing because they're able to do some of that work back in the shop.
Great point. Great point. Ryan Manis, do you have anything to add there on Megatrends?
Yeah, I think pretty much I see a common theme in remote work. And I think that will be a trend moving forward. You've already seen certain companies, I think it was Twitter that most recently said that their employees did not have to come back indefinitely. I don't think that that's going to be the majority of companies. I think the majority of companies, and look, we all have pretty short-term memories, and after a couple months of everything going back to quote normal, who knows, this might be, really out of mind and we'll all be packed into offices again. But I think remote work will be a common theme we'll see, especially with the office staff and the project managers and project operations. And then in the fields, obviously it's hard to put work in place remotely, but then the prefabrication offsite, that will, I think, continue to increase. And that was already increasing before this ever occurred. So this may not, prefabrication offsite might not necessarily be symptomatic of COVID-19, but rather COVID-19 might simply just accelerate that in the industry. And then I think that there will be further thought on putting together construction schedules and the reliability of supply chain, the challenges to the just-in-time model. We're already seeing issues with that with tariffs, and now add this on top of it. I think that that construction scheduling will be impacted by this, at least into the future.
Great, thank you, Ryan. How about you, Phil Shoemaker? Do you see any mega trends in the safety training world?
Well, Richard, I think one thing you touched on was the pandemics that I don't think they're going to go away. They're here to stay. So I think we've become more acclimated in our industry to address these with best practices. So I believe some of these best practices that we've implemented will continue on and actually make a more sanitized, cleaner job site, which might reduce more colds and flus and some other things that actually affect our productivity on the job site. I mean, companies now are pretty clear. If you have a temperature, we don't want you at work, and it doesn't matter if it's a COVID-19 or whatever it might be, but that affects all of us in our productivity. So I think that's positive, and I think more best practices will continue to evolve, and if this occurs again, we'll be more ready to deal with it. So,
thank you, Phil. Thank you. So, how about the audience? Are there any thoughts or questions that something you heard today that you want to ask one of our panelists today? I'll ask Don Taylor to kind of track those and ask those questions.
You bet. We've had some good questions come in. So let's start. I've got 3, and I think we've got time to do just about 3. Christy Martin asked, what about sightline reduction using masks on job sites? I've heard of people tripping on rebar, etc., when using a nose/mouth mask. So sightline questions when PPE is involved.
you want me to answer that, or?
Yeah, go ahead, Phil.
That questions with masks have been brought up like that, as we know. And I was on a job site a couple this week, and I wear glasses, and they fog your glasses up. So, there are no fog glasses out there, but the you know, I think making sure you have the right type of mask for the individual. You know, right now there's a lot of them one size fits all. Well, we have a gentleman in our office that has a mega beard, and we gave him some masks, and he goes, "These masks don't fit me at all. You know, can I have a scarf?" So that works for him. It protects him. So I think addressing the personal protective equipment that fits you the right way, and addressing that with your organization is definitely a way to go where you're not worried about that issue.
Great. Here's another question. We're going to get a little serious here for a minute. What concerns should we have about lawsuits if an employee contracts COVID-19 and dies, whether contracted on the job site or not, but can't prove where they contracted it?
Yeah, I'll touch on that. I mean, I've been asked that question quite a bit in the recent past. I'll be honest, I'm not losing sleep over it. Look, at the end of the day, there's no difference between COVID-19 and influenza or norovirus, except that influenza and norovirus, by and large, are not pandemics. So they're not prevalent throughout the world. And we don't ask these questions or really have these concerns about someone dying of influenza on your job site. First of all, I think would be some significant proof issues. I don't know how the deceased or their estate or someone that contracted on the site is going to prove that they got it on site. How can you say you didn't get it coming to the project site, or from a family member, or from going to the grocery store, or, you know, run down the list of other places you can get it. I think provided that you're not negligent in your control of a job site or workplace or office, and that you have best practices established, I think that you would have a hard time being held accountable for any damages. And then, you know, finally, I think that the places that you will likely see lawsuits arise are places that you've seen in the news already, right? Meatpacking plants, nursing homes, cruise ships. You know, when they talk about these meatpacking plants where there's been an outbreak of, 120 cases, people are shoulder to shoulder. There's absolutely no best practices there, and they're forcing people to come to work or you're fired. I think you might have some culpability. But when you've got a job site where there is an outbreak, and as soon as there's an outbreak, you handle it, you disinfect the site. Let's say you have everyone leave the site, you do tracing and testing. I don't think that there's that much to worry about at the end of the day.
Great. It's a good thing. I don't know if it was mentioned that Ryan also has a JD, so he gets to wear a couple of different hats. Here's another question, which I thought was interesting because it involves new technologies usage. Do you envision a new level of regulation that may come about due to the increased use of electronic surveillance, maybe that's drones included, and how this may clash with privacy concerns?
I mean, we've looked at that issue here at McCownGordon. We've been using drones a long time, but we've recently implemented an official drone program. There is insurance products out there. We just got one for drone insurance. And a lot of the liability associated with drones is, as you mentioned, the privacy concerns, the recording of information that you're not supposed to record, things like that. Are there concerns when, they've talked about the technology that you can implement and that governments have implemented? You've probably heard of the technology in China where they're able to sort of broadcast and see whether people have temperatures. Does that, here in the United States violate privacy concerns? I don't know. Probably we'll see. And I think it'll be developing moving forward. Great.
There was one final item that came in through the chat. It seems more like a recommendation or just a sharing of an experience, but maybe there's a comment that any of you might want to follow up with. As part of my site observation practices, I choose times to visit the site when the majority of the contractors are off-site in the late afternoons. The contractor on the project also takes periodic 3D imaging with room labeling for me to observe conditions. This seems to do with some of the comments before on it. It's nice when there's collaboration and advanced communication of when someone would want to come and best time, most easy to implement site visit is. Does anyone have any follow-ups on that?
I can address that. Yeah, that's been protocols that we've taken is when can we be on the job site when the fewest people are present, and that way we're not stepping around people. We're able to keep ourselves distant as well as protect them. And then I think one of these trends that we're going to see is that ability. We've already done, we've been doing the 360 viewer cameras. Those are getting more and more economical. This documentation that we're able to really track progress digitally, I think is really going to take hold and offer us better records of our site visits. And then we can balance out, maybe even be able to do better documentation because we don't have to spend the travel time to see it as often.
And Amy, and I think with part of that is just maybe a best practice for any job site visit of, increasing the communication with the contractor, what parts of the site are safe to observe, just general open, shafts, things like that. Or, I had a consultant the other day was talking about they were in one of the cities and was going to stop by the job site, but his other engineer in the car said, "Oh, we got an email. It said, no visitors to the site," which is really meant for, county officials or people just stopping by and doing casual tours. But, we explained we don't just want you to do a stop by, give the contractor a heads up so you can make sure that, what welding or other work that could be going on that may not be safe if you have the proper PPE in a normal environment. Making sure that everything's ready to observe in a safe manner, interrupting, construction activity, and you're not in places that might be, unsafe, without regular communication.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Don, for providing those questions, and thank you, everyone, for addressing those. I just want to say one last thanks to the panelists and the participants. You've both given us a lot to think about. Special thanks to AIA-KC President Ryan Warman for developing this concept, Don Taylor and Don Greenwell for their leadership in implementing Ryan's ideas, and Ryan Johnson, our Information Technology Director for the Builders Association, for his tech mastery. Please stay tuned for more content from the AIA-KC and the Builders Association on future trends in June, July timeframe. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.